Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and today I'm going to continue on my Beatle album reviews. And I've been taking a closer look at the US releases, and today's review is going to be on the US version of Help. Now, this is a soundtrack, and extremely different from the UK version. Now, this album was released in August of 1965 to coincide with the film. The UK version was released a week earlier, and it got to the #1 spot in the United States and was there for 9 weeks. Now, this album was released just 8 weeks after the Beatles 6, which was another watered-down Capitol compilation. And this album was waited for and very much anticipated as a big release, unlike these other Capitol, the previous few Capitol releases, Beatles 65 and such. This came with the film. So this is kind of, 1965 is a repeat of 1964, and they wanted to hopefully have the same success that they had with A Hard Day's Night, with the Help movie. Now, it's important to mention that the songs on the Help soundtrack are a step forward from the Beatles for Sale, which just came out in late 1964. So the Beatles are continuing to grow here, and we see that in evidence here on this album. So this album consists of only 7 songs, 7 Beatles songs, and there are 5 Ken Thorne instrumentals. So if you're familiar with the film, it's a spy spoof, and there's an Indian cult that's also being spoofed. So therefore, you've got this Indian-style music featuring sitars, etc. This is where Harrison really took notice of the sitar. So that's the type of incidental music that's on this soundtrack. Now, it's hard not to bring up the British release, which has 14 tracks. So all the soundtrack songs are on side 1 of this album, of the UK version, and you get a whole other side of Beatle music on side 2. Not so with this album here. This has got the Ken Thorne instrumentals peppered throughout, and it makes for a very awkward listen. But here are the Beatles songs that were on side 1 of the UK version that are sprinkled through this entire album of the US version.
Help, I need somebody. Hey, you've got to hide your love away. You don't realize how much I need you. Another girl, you're making me say that I've got nobody but you. I think it's today.
Obviously, the lead-off track, Help, is one of John Lennon's first introspective songs, and it's got that James Bond intro on it. Now, that's the version I grew up with because I had the Red album, 62 to 66, and they kept that on the beginning of that song on that version. So that's the version I've always liked, and I just thought it added excitement to it. The Night Before, excellent McCartney song, great use of the electric piano. You've got to Hide Your Love Away. Great John Lennon song of a very taboo topic. And this is the first song where they bring in some, I guess you'd say, orchestration or like session players, and this is on the flute. The next song, George Harrison's I Need You, interesting use of the tone pedal for the guitar there. Then we have Another Girl, then Ticket to Ride, one of the great early Beatles tracks. Lennon always said this sounded like a prototype of a heavy metal song. I'm inclined to agree with him on that. And then the fun song, You're Gonna Lose That Girl, great vocals and backing vocals by the Beatles. I think it's important to also note that Ticket to Ride was the first time the Beatles laid down their vocals afterwards, along with the guitar work. So they're starting to do a couple different things in the studio, getting a little more sophisticated. I know that doesn't sound that sophisticated by Sgt. Pepper standards, but this was a new thing for them in the studio, and they're taking more time and care on their songs, and particularly the singles. As I said, these songs are an advancement from the prior album, but I think this soundtrack in particular, it gets overlooked because of the Ken Thorne instrumentals. Now, Thorne's music is hardly memorable, and it sounds like he's a composer who's not taking his subject matter seriously. Now, for his defense, the film wasn't very serious at all, and this Eastern cult places it in a different part of the world, so he's trying to bring in music from that part of the world, hence the sitar type of music, which doesn't go that well with the Beatles' music at this time, and it could have been probably a lot better, but Thorne goes over the top, and it makes it hard for any of us to really take his music seriously. So there's a couple Beatles songs that were used from older songs like From Me to You, and we've got kind of a sitar version of a Hard Day's Night here. Kind of silly, and a lot of this stuff is rather silly, except for that James Bond intro, which I mentioned is probably the best part of all of his soundtrack work. Now, what's interesting is that Thorne was given a lot more leeway and a lot more budget for orchestration on this album, and he just didn't use it to his advantage. And it pales, I think, to George Martin's score on A Hard Day's Night. Now, Martin's score on A Hard Day's Night, to me, it fits the film better. It's very loungy and, it's got that soundtrack period feel to it. But I think it works better. And once you put the other Beatles songs with the George Martin songs on A Hard Day's Night, they kind of work together. Not the case here on this Help soundtrack. You may be asking, why in the world did George Martin not get the job to do the score for Help like he had done on A Hard Day's Night? And that's very simple. The reason is that Richard Lester and George Martin did not like each other. They didn't get along at all. So for this movie, Lester brought in his guy, Ken Thorne. Now, Thorne, as I mentioned, had a budget for this movie to do some very special work. He even used pieces from Wagner, Tchaikovsky, and Beethoven in some of these scores here, but would you even notice? I mean, it's to no effect at all. One thing that probably would have helped this soundtrack is if Ken Thorne's instrumentals were put on side 2 and all the Beatles originals were on side 1. At least that would have been a better listen, or at least made it easier to avoid the Ken Thorne instrumentals. Now, Ken Thorne's work up until now consisted of 5 soundtracks, and these were lesser-known British films, one of which was directed by Dick Lester. Because of the rift between Martin and Lester, George Martin did his own quasi-soundtrack, and that's this, the George Martin Orchestra. So this album is pretty typical George Martin scoring. He does all the songs from the movie, plus a few other songs, even that they go by different names, like Auntie Gin's theme, that's I've Just Seen a Face, that's A Nice Hat Cap, that's It's Only Love, and Scrambled Egg, that's Yesterday. So those are all listed here. And I would say that they're just more listenable. And I think that had Martin, because he understood the Beatles better, and I think he would have done fine scoring Help, even bringing in some exotic instrumentation, I think he wouldn't have gone so far in one direction, mixing the Beatles songs with Ken Thorne's instrumentals really a bad idea. They just don't go together at all. I don't know anybody that listens to this soundtrack start to finish. I would do that with Hard Day's Night. I don't do that with Help. The UK version of Help has 14 tracks, so the songs that appear on side 2 are a little bit lesser known songs, or probably songs that are not as strong as side 1 in most cases, and those are these songs.
They're gonna put me in the movies. It's only love, and that is all. But it's so hard loving you, 'cause you like me too much and I like you. Tell me what you see. Falling, yes I am falling, and she keeps calling me back again. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
Okay, so on side 2 of the UK version, you've got the great opener, Act Naturally. More on that song later. It goes from there to It's Only Love, a song John Lennon really hated of his. He hated the lyric. George Harrison's You Like Me Too Much, only okay. Tell Me What You See. Paul McCartney described this song as filler. He was right. I've just seen a face. This is one of the stronger tracks on side two, somewhat of a departure, a little more countryish. And finally, we've got Yesterday, or not finally, but up next, Yesterday. More on that in a moment. The most covered song in pop history. And ending the album, we have the anachronistic Dizzy Miss Lizzy, a song that I find to be one of their most boring songs ever. So that is side two, but at least you get more Beatles songs. And some of those songs, like You Like Me Too Much, Tell Me What You See in Dizzy Miss Lizzy, those wound up on coming out before Help on this American release, Beatles 6. You've probably gathered from my past reviews that I always prefer Beatle originals to covers, and they had an opportunity here to have an album of all originals. There were two B-sides that didn't make it onto this album. That's Yes It Is and I'm Down. Perfect for this album. In fact, I'm Down would have been a very good side two closer. So that is a big miss. Now, there was another song they had recorded during these sessions, and that was called Wait. And that song ended up not going on the album and got pushed to the next album. And two songs that were unreleased, That Means a Lot and If You've Got Trouble. So If You've Got Trouble is the Ringo vocal that is so shit that they didn't even bother releasing it. That's why they ended up doing Act Naturally, because they had to have something that they weren't embarrassed by. Rock on anybody, Ringo says in that song. Now, That Means a Lot isn't much better. In fact, pity PJ Proby's version of this. But that's another song that was probably best left unreleased. And both of those songs got released decades later in the anthology. They also had recorded Bad Boy, which also found its way into Beatles 6. That was also a cover. So, those are the songs. Let's talk about the artwork here a little bit. Now, this album cover, let's look at the British one first. It's so much of a better cover. So the Brits always give us a more artistic cover. Here you've got the Beatles front and center in color, very minimalistic, almost like a precursor to the White Album in some ways. But the American version, super commercial. The Beatles aren't even in color here, using these garish colors here. And it says, an exclusive instrumental music from the picture soundtrack. Ooh, wonderful. What's funny is that this album that they call on the inside as a very special movie soundtrack souvenir album. And as you can see, a very nice gatefold here, almost all color photos. There's no reason to not have these colored. But anyway, that would have been a little bit better. But this album cost $1 more than other albums that came out, and that's to cover the cost probably of the so-called souvenir edition. Very nice back cover, a great photo here. So it's very commercial, but it is, I have to keep remembering and remind myself, it is a soundtrack. So 60s soundtracks generally were a little bit more commercial looking and put together to sell to a wider audience. So that's what we get on this one. Not so here. Robert Freeman was the photographer who did the photo, and his idea to do the semaphore to spell out the word help. The problem is that when he did that, the way the Beatles were positioned, it did not look good. So what he did, he just positioned them in the best way they looked. So this doesn't really spell out anything. And they actually changed up the positioning on the US version for some reason. I don't know. I don't know why. They could have used color photos on this edition, but Capitol thought otherwise. I'd like to talk a little bit about the singles from the album Help, because I think they're very notable. And during the first half of the Beatles' career, they were really known by their singles. So the first single release was Ticket to Ride. And as Lennon had said, it was an important song because it was a very heavy song, which I agree with. And I find it to be more of an early raga song. The way the guitars are played, there's a slight drone to it. So that's something that would be explored more in the next couple of albums. In Ticket to Ride, there's this coda change, and there's a double time rhythm in the bridge. And it's a longer fade out. So this song, I think, goes just over 3 minutes. So it's a little bit of a longer song for the Beatles as well. Ian MacDonald described the song as psychologically deeper than anything the Beatles had recorded before and extraordinary for its time. Now, one of the things that, as great as the song is, it's the only song that's recorded or released in fake stereo. It's a dual phonic song as released on this soundtrack. I don't know what they were thinking. The next single, Help, was released in July of 1965 to coincide with the opening of the movie. So this was an energetic song. And again, one of Lennon's introspective songs. He was really struggling personally, and you never would know because it's a very upbeat song. But the original song was slower, and they sped it up, like I think at George Martin's request, just like they did Please Please Me, and made a pop gem out of it. Well, really, it's not very poppy if you listen to the lyrics, but a great song and one of their great early songs as well. We always talk about how Capitol butchered the Beatles albums in the United States and made these compilations and were very chintzy with some of the tracks, sometimes only having 11 tracks compared to 14 tracks on the UK counterpart. But one of the things that Capitol did well, not only did they release more albums because they did their compilations in that way where it gave them extra tracks, but they also released more singles. So the third single off this album is the very unlikely song Act Naturally. Now, this was kind of an interesting single because Capitol totally tone deaf on what was going on at the time. And they're thinking, well, Ringo's kind of the acting Beatle, I guess. Let's give him a single. This will be a number one song. I mean, I can't think of a worse song to release as a single by the Beatles, really. Well, there are probably a couple worse, but that song was where Capitol's heads were at. And this is how they were promoting the world's top act. One of the things it's important to understand was the summer of 65 and the spring of 65, really, and all the Beatles competition that was coming out. One of the problems with Help and doing a film is most of these songs were recorded February, March of 65, but all these songs had to wait and sit in the can while the film was getting done. Meanwhile, here's what the competition was putting out. So in April, you've got Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. Satisfaction came out in June by the Stones. Heartful of Soul by the Yardbirds in June. That actually used a sitar in the original version, but that got scrapped because it sounded like crap. Help came out in July 65. See My Friends, Like a Rolling Stone, Do You Believe in Magic, all July of 65. And then what comes out in September 65? Act Naturally. Lucky for Capitol, the Beatles had so many good songs that they just by luck put Yesterday on the B-side, and that's what the DJ started playing, and it went over huge, obviously. So how do we know it was the B-side? Well, on the Capitol labels, the swirl labels, they didn't designate A or B-side on these. But when this got reissued on Apple, they didn't bother to flip it. So we have Act Naturally on the full Apple, which is the A-side, and Yesterday on the B-side. So that's how we know Act Naturally was proposed as the A-side. Obviously, it was very fortunate for everybody involved that Yesterday was on that B-side because you can see the competition the Beatles were up against. And Yesterday put the Beatles right up there with everybody. One of the greatest songs, the most recorded or the most played song on radio in the 20th century, one of the great pop songs of all time. So that is really a culmination of Help, are those three songs, three of their greatest songs. It's really surprising how overlooked this album is with those three songs on it. This is the part of the review when I talk about how can we make this soundtrack better. Now, obviously, one of the things would be, if you have to have the Ken Thorne instrumentals, is put all the Beatles songs on one side, Ken Thorne's instrumentals on the back side. But one of the things that just cries out to me, and this is hindsight, of course, but what the Beatles missed here, and Epstein missed, and George Martin missed, is the Beatles really should have been doing their own soundtrack recordings for this. Imagine, they would have gotten the money. They had great songs here. Here's a couple examples of what they could have done. For example, they could have done a slower version of Help in some way, and it could have been orchestrated like the George Martin version was, and that would have at least given a couple different feels of that song. The other thing is Yesterday, which was a song that wasn't really used in the soundtrack, but everybody knew that was a special song. Martin knew it right off the bat. The Beatles knew it. That's a song they could have done some different things with. They could have done a full band version of that, done a faster version maybe. They could have used that in the film. There's all kinds of chase stuff in the film, so you never know. Could have been used that way. The other one that I think would have been, could have used a little more work is the song I Need You by George Harrison. Now this song would have also benefited from a slow version. Here's an example of what it might have sounded like.
So come on back to me, I'm lonely as can be. I need you.
That version of the song was done by the group The Sunshine Company, and it was done, I believe that was late 1967. So that gives you an idea of the different vocal harmonies they could have used or slowed it down. Really a great version of that song. So you had all kinds of opportunities here, but obviously the Beatles' lives were going so crazy and they were so fast, how they can't cover all the bases. But that's one base I wish they would have covered. One of the things that also is worth mentioning about a couple tracks on this album, particularly the song Help and Yesterday, is the Beatles are writing as if they're much older men. If you listen to the lyrics, they sound like they're aged, they're wise beyond their age, which they were probably from living so much life as Beatles in this short period of time. So I think that's what made these songs so timeless, is because of the idea of them looking back on their lives. So I think that's notable. Now, Help was nominated in the category of Album of the Year for a Grammy in 1966. The nomination marked the first time that a rock band had been recognized in this category. So that also was a first. And despite Ken Thorne's sabotage of this soundtrack album, obviously it's still a period piece, and it really introduced some new songs to George Harrison, which gets explored more in the next album. Thank you for watching this Beatles review. This is my first one in a while, but I'm going to get back to my Beatle reviews. The next one I'll probably do is a review of the film Help, so do look out for that. Also check out popgoesthe60s.com. I've got some fun merchandise on there. You can purchase some Beatle-related stuff, and there's other ways to help support this channel that are listed below in the description. So as always, I thank you for watching Pop Goes the 60s.